Okay, so you're here with us because you like to, get a real solid understanding of something, kind of complex, right? But you don't want to get lost in the weeds.
Right.
You don't want to be wading through like endless details and all that.
Exactly.
We're going to do that today with the Karen Reed case.
Yep.
And specifically, we're going to be doing a deep dive into some YouTube transcripts from the channel Masshole Mafia.
Right. These videos present a very specific perspective on the whole Karen Reed saga, the whole Free Karen Reed movement, and all the different individuals involved.
Right.
So it's really important for listeners to understand that, what we're doing is we're looking at the arguments and claims within these sources themselves.
Right.
We're not going to be making any judgments about whether or not what they're saying is true or false.
Exactly.
We're not taking sides. In this case, it's obviously a very highly charged situation.
Absolutely.
But what we are doing is we're putting on our analytical hats and really kind of digging deep to understand this particular viewpoint.
Yeah, our mission here is not to, decide, who's right or wrong or, take sides or anything like that.
Right.
It's really just to sort of extract what are the core claims, what's the narrative that's being constructed here,
Right.
and what are the significant details that they're highlighting in their analyses.
Exactly.
So we're kind of your guides through this this particular interpretation that's out there.
Right. And I think to follow along, it's helpful to lay out who these central figures are as presented in these YouTube videos.
Yes, definitely.
Right. So we start obviously with Karen Reed, the woman accused of murdering her boyfriend, John O'Keefe.
Right. And just so everybody's clear, John O'Keefe is the person who died in this case.
That's right. The deceased in this case.
Right.
And then we have the YouTube channel itself, Masshole Mafia.
Right.
That's producing all of this content, commentary and analysis of this case.
Right. And then there's Nick and Jenna Rocco.
Right. They are, according to these videos, they are the administrators of a very large Facebook support group for Karen Reed.
Right.
They've been deeply involved in raising funds for her defense.
Okay.
And they're portrayed as not just organizers, but also key figures in some of the alleged financial impropriety that's being discussed.
Right.
For example, they were running unlicensed raffles and things of that nature.
Right. Then there's Karen Reed's family, her parents, Bill and Janet Reed, her cousin Kelly, her brother Nathan.
Right.
And they're all depicted in these videos as being actively involved in supporting her and supporting her version of events.
Right. Another key figure in this narrative, as presented by Masshole Mafia, is Aidan Kearney, often referred to as Turtle Boy.
Right.
He is now facing charges related to witness intimidation.
Right.
He was at one point a very vocal supporter of Karen Reed.
Okay.
And then there was this very dramatic falling out between him and others in the Free Karen Reed movement.
Oh, interesting.
And then lastly, we should mention Alan Jackson, Karen Reed's attorney.
Right.
He features prominently in the videos as well, particularly in relation to her legal strategy and the fundraising that's being discussed.
Right. Okay, so those are kind of the main players that we're dealing with as they're framed in these YouTube videos.
Right.
So let's talk about what are the main arguments and recurring themes that emerge from these sources.
Right.
So like what is it that they're really trying to get across?
Yeah. Well, one central thread that runs through the Masshole Mafia analysis is the allegation that Karen Reed and her supporters aren't just advocating for justice.
Right.
They're actively engaged in a conspiracy and a cover-up.
Right.
And these accusations involve some pretty serious claims like witness harassment.
Right.
And even attempts to tamper with the jury pool.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it paints a very different picture than just simply, the wrongfully accused narrative.
Yeah, it's much more active, much more sort of manipulative than just, I'm innocent and everybody's out to get me.
And what's interesting is the accusation that while publicly alleging a conspiracy against Karen Reed,
right,
she and her inner circle are orchestrating their own.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's like a level of, deception and manipulation coming from within the Free Karen Reed movement itself.
Wow. So it's like conspiracy on top of conspiracy.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you make of a situation where those claiming to be victims are themselves accused of similar actions?
Right. Well, I mean, it certainly muddies the waters.
It does.
I think it's always important to remember that, there's always more than one side to a story.
Right.
And it sounds like in this case, there's, multiple layers.
Yeah.
Of, people alleging that other people are doing something wrong.
Right.
And I think, when you get into that kind of territory, it can be very, very difficult to sort of parse out, what's really going on. So I think it's just a reminder to be cautious and to be skeptical
Right.
and to really try to look at all the different, perspectives and evidence before forming an opinion.
Right.
Okay, so another big area that these videos look at is the financial side of the Free Karen Reed movement.
Right.
And so there's a lot of, claims and questions about how's the fundraising being done, where's the money going, and they're really suggesting that there's a lack of transparency,
Yes.
which could point to grifting or maybe even fraud.
That's right. They point to a few key details to kind of support this argument.
Right.
So, for example, they highlight the fact that Karen Reed had already retained and paid both her initial legal representation and her current attorney
Right.
before any public fundraising efforts even began.
Okay.
And then when you look at the publicly known costs associated with expert witnesses, they've been relatively modest.
Right.
So the question becomes, where is all this money going if it's not going to, lawyers and expert witnesses?
Right. Hundreds of thousands of dollars unaccounted for.
Exactly. And then you have the issue of Karen Reed's reported claims about being in $5 million of legal debt.
Right.
A figure that her own attorney, Alan Jackson, reportedly contradicted by stating that his legal team is actually working pro bono.
Right.
So you have this inconsistency there that raises more questions.
Yeah, that's not a small discrepancy.
No, it's a big one.
$5 million versus zero.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you have this contrast that Mass Whole Mafia points out between Karen Reed's claimed financial distress
Right.
and her observed lifestyle.
Right. Like she's staying in what appears to be very expensive hotels.
Right. Upscale restaurants, designer clothing.
Right.
All of these things that don't really line up with the image of someone facing financial ruin
Right.
due to legal fees.
Okay, so they're saying that's suspicious.
Right. They also point out this juxtaposition between Karen's seemingly comfortable lifestyle and the public appeals for financial contributions being made by her brother.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's this instance where her brother was asking for donations to help pay for gas.
Right.
For Karen to get to court.
Right.
While she's, staying in, a five-star hotel.
Okay.
So it just creates this disconnect.
Right.
That feeds into this idea that the fundraising isn't what it seems.
Right. Okay, so they're saying that the fundraising itself is potentially suspicious.
Potentially suspicious, yes.
Okay.
And they also raise concerns about, where the donations are coming from.
Okay.
There are these repeated small donations that come from an individual who runs a professional fundraising company.
Right.
So they suggest that this could be a way to kind of artificially inflate the level of grassroots support for Karen Reed.
Right. So make it seem like there's more people supporting her than there really are.
Right.
Okay. And then they also talk about the fact that there was a drop-off in the number of people showing up to the courthouse to support her. Once the fundraising efforts started to decline,
right.
So they're suggesting that maybe those people were being paid to be there.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay. And so then they kind of take it a step further and they start talking about potentially illegal activities.
Right.
Like misrepresenting how the donation funds are being used, unlicensed raffles, tax evasion.
Right.
So now we're getting into some serious legal territory.
That's right. It's suggesting that this is something that could potentially attract the attention of federal authorities.
Right. So it's not just, bad optics.
Right.
It's actually, potentially criminal behavior.
Right.
Okay. So now let's talk about the third video,
right.
which is called The Cold-Blooded Femme Fatale Who Couldn't Stay Quiet, Karen Reed.
Right.
So this one is all about Karen Reed's own words.
Exactly.
And how they may have impacted her case.
Right. And the main argument here is that her inability to remain silent has resulted in a significant number of inconsistencies.
Right.
And even what appear to be self-incriminating statements.
Right. Okay, so what are some specific examples of that?
Well, they highlight, varying accounts that she's given regarding her last interactions with John O'Keefe.
Right.
And the explanations that she's offered about how he might have sustained his injuries.
Right.
So those shifting narratives really undermine her credibility.
Right.
And of course, you have the very infamous statement, "I said I hit him."
Right.
Which she later tried to downplay as a question or a hypothetical.
Right.
But, the fact that she had to try to walk that back.
Right.
Just, makes the whole thing look worse.
Right. It just makes you wonder, well, why did you say that in the first place?
Exactly. And even some people who initially supported Karen Reed have acknowledged that her public appearances, like her participation in the HBO documentary
Right.
have actually damaged her case.
Oh, okay.
They've made her appear unsympathetic or even guilty to a wider audience.
Right, and they also talk about the lack of remorse that
Right.
she's displayed in her public statements.
Particularly in relation to John O'Keefe and his family.
Right.
So it feeds into this perception that she's, cold and calculating,
Yeah, okay.
and that she's not really taking responsibility for her actions.
Right, and then they go on to analyze some of her statements as potential admissions of guilt.
Right.
Like when she repeatedly suggests that she might have clipped John O'Keefe with her vehicle.
Right, and those statements, even if they were unintended,
Right.
they do seem to align with the prosecution's theory of the case.
Right.
So it's difficult to just dismiss them as, accidental slips of the tongue.
Right, and they also point out that her statements have provided supporting evidence for new potential criminal charges,
Right.
like conspiracy to commit witness intimidation.
Right, her recorded statements and communications involving her attorneys and Aidan Kearney, they
Right.
all seem to support this ongoing investigation.
Right, and the fact that her legal team was communicating with Aidan Kearney while he was allegedly intimidating witnesses.
Right.
I mean, that just seems so incredibly unethical.
It's a very serious allegation.
Right.
And it raises questions about the conduct of her representation.
Right, and then there's the fact that her attorneys were publicly reprimanded by the judge for
Right.
repeatedly making misstatements.
Right. So again, it creates this impression that the defense strategy is based on deception
Right.
rather than factual accuracy.
Okay, so let's just wrap up by summarizing the key claims that are made in these videos.
Right.
So number one, the big one is that Karen Reed and her supporters are actively involved in a cover-up and conspiracy.
Right. And that includes witness harassment,
Mm.
potential attempts to tamper with the jury,
Right.
all while publicly claiming to be victims of a conspiracy themselves.
Right. It's like they're accusing the other side of doing exactly what they're doing.
Exactly.
Okay, number two, there are serious concerns about the finances of the Free Karen Reed movement.
Right. A lack of transparency,
Right.
potential grifting, or even fraudulent activity.
Right. And a big discrepancy between Karen Reed's claims of financial hardship and her actual lifestyle.
Right.
Number three, Karen Reed's own words may have hurt her case.
Right. Inconsistencies,
Right.
self-damaging statements,
Right.
and even potential admissions of guilt.
Right. And lastly, Masshole Mafia highlights the internal conflicts and fracturing within the Free Karen Reed movement.
Right. Particularly the falling out with Aidan Kearney.
Right. So it suggests that maybe this unified front of support isn't so unified after all.
Exactly.
So given all of these claims and all of this information,
Right.
what do you think it means when a public narrative of innocence clashes so strongly with allegations of deception
Right.
coming from within its own ranks?
Yeah, it really makes you think about, how do we as consumers of information, how do we navigate these complex situations where there are, strong narratives and personal agendas at play?
Right.
How do we discern, what is actually happening?
Right. And what are the implications for justice and truth
Right.
when we have these kind of competing narratives?
Right.
And I think it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that, we all need to be aware of
Right.
and really think critically about.
Exactly.
So, as you're listening to this and as you're thinking about all of this information,
Right.
what other questions are coming up for you?
Yeah.
What else do you want to know?
Hmm.
What other angles do you think are important to explore
Right.
in order to really, get a full understanding of what's going on here?
Yeah, because this is just one perspective
Right.
on a very multifaceted case.
Exactly. And that's what we're all about here.
Yeah.
It's just giving you that perspective
Right.
and then letting you kind of decide, what you think and where you want to go from there.
Exactly.
So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.